If sonnets were one craze of the early modern era, pastoral poetry was another. These are not the only poetry crazes, by the way, just some of them. Pastoral poetry glorified country life. Its characters were usually shepherds, or some other kind of person you'd typically find in the country. The plot centers around singing contests and love for the most part, although you will find some pastoral poems that are making veiled political commentary and are satirical. On the opposite end of the style spectrum, epics or heroic poetry was also popular. Spenser's The Faerie Queene is one example of this. I'd now like to talk about some of the personalities we'll meet in the course readings in the Elizabethan age. First off is Christopher Marlowe, a poet and playwright and the author of The Passionate Shepherd, which I assigned for your reading this week. Kit Marlowe, as he was known to his friends, lived a very full life in his brief 29 years, some of it quite wild. And you can see in his portrait here a sense of that kind of restless but confident young soul. An air of intrigue and secrecy surrounds Marlowe, who is on record as having done Elizabeth, quote, good service, close quote, of some kind, and, quote, it is not in her majesty's pleasure that anyone employed as he had been in matters touching the benefit of his country should be defamed by those that are ignorant of the affairs he went about, close quote. So I'm not going to critique him here. He was a member of a group known as the University Wits, which were university-educated men who strove to make a living after their university years as professional writers. Born just 2 months before Shakespeare, Marlowe became a theatrical success at the very young age of 23, whereas Shakespeare was still relatively unknown when Marlowe died in 1593. Marlowe's major works include poems like Hero and Leander and The Passionate Shepherd, as well as plays like Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, and The Jew of Malta. Marlowe died when someone stabbed him in the back with a dagger at a pub. The official line was that the argument over the bill precipitated the stabbing, but modern scholars have learned that several of the patrons of the pub were known spies or double agents. Queen Elizabeth had a healthy network of spies under the direction of Sir Francis Walsingham from 1569 onwards to protect her queenship against Catholic radicals who might want to assassinate her, and from the conspiring of her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. If you're interested in Elizabeth's spy network, I put a link to a website at the end of these lecture notes. I've included Marlowe's pastoral poem, The Passionate Shepherd, in the syllabus, in part as an example of this poetic genre. You can see how the poem, which is about a love proposition, elevates the joys of country living and its bounty. However, I've also included this very famous poem in order to demonstrate the coterie culture at work. Marlowe's poem would have circulated in manuscript, or a handwritten copy, among other writers in the coterie. And we have a record of one fellow poet who decided to reply to him. Next up, Sir Walter Raleigh's The Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd. Sir Walter Raleigh was an accomplished man on many fronts. He was a soldier, administrator, explorer, and organizer of voyages of exploration. For instance, he was responsible for putting together the doomed colony of Roanoke Island, and he is the namesake of Raleigh, North Carolina. Maybe Marlowe would have had just as many interests as Raleigh had he lived longer. Raleigh was knighted in 1585 by Queen Elizabeth, and he became the captain of her guard. He was a great favorite of the Queen, and they exchanged poetry with each other. You can find an example of Queen Elizabeth's response to Raleigh in the Women in Power section in the anthology. We are talking about him here because he wrote a response poem to Marlowe's pastoral, The Passionate Shepherd. Raleigh was a passionate contributor in the coterie of poets that inhabited Elizabeth's court, but he was equally passionate about not appearing in print. You can read his Nymph's Reply to the Shepherd in our anthology for this unit, but it's not the only response to Marlowe's famous pastoral. We also have John Donne's The Bait, which is from a slightly later time period, and is also included in the Orange Anthology, Volume B. In addition, there are some more modern satires and adaptations of this poem, including The Passionate Freudian to His Love by Dorothy Parker, Love Under the Republicans or Democrats by Ogden Nash, and Raleigh Was Right by William Carlos Williams. Included in the readings for this week is Amelia Lanyer's Eve's Apology, from her volume of poems entitled Salve Deus Rex Judeorum, published in 1611. Lanyer was from a family of court musicians and was the mistress of Lord Hunsdon, a patron of Shakespeare, for many years. She later married another musician and moved away from the court. However, she would have been exposed to the coterie of poets and the court, and would have been an observer of all this poetic activity and the power of Queen Elizabeth. There were women writing during the early modern era, but many of these female authors were wealthy noblewomen who didn't need to have a side job and wrote poetry as a hobby. Amelia Lanyer is different because she was the first female writer to actively seek patronage. Many poets who were not part of the coterie of amateurs had to secure funding from a patron in order to write. Lanyer was able to secure the patronage of Margaret Clifford, the Countess of Cumberland, for a time, and she invented a new genre of poem that would become popular, the country house poem. Lanyer's country house poem is called The Description of Cookham, and is contained in the anthology just after the assigned poem Eve's Apology in Defense of Women. I've included Eve's Apology in our course syllabus for two reasons. First, I wanted to include a work by a female poet in this time period. Female writers did exist, and it's time we heard from one. Secondly, there was an actual debate about women and their worth and their role going on in print at this time. It is sometimes called the pamphlet wars because pamphlets pro and against women were circulating back and forth and taking each other on. The basic argument on the side of the misogynists is that women were a corrupting influence on humankind from the Garden of Eden onwards. You can read this argument in Joseph Swetnam's The Arraignment of Lewd, Idle, Froward, and Unconstant Women in our anthology on page 1200, as well as Rachel Spaeth's reply. By presenting Eve's apology means more like a defense here, Lanyer argues for the worth of female virtue and intellect, using male and female characters from the Bible. I want to spend a few moments talking about Queen Elizabeth I and how she influenced poetry. I'm starting with this slide showing various paintings of her. These aren't the only ones, by the way, just a few of them. Queen Elizabeth and her counselors used propaganda deliberately to consolidate and strengthen her power. I'll talk about why in a bit. We see here 3 paintings depicting Elizabeth as Gloriana, the name Spenser gives her in his unfinished epic poem The Faerie Queen. The painting on the left was commissioned by a courtier who had made Queen Elizabeth mad at him. You can see the symbolism of the storm of her anger over her left shoulder, and the cloud break over her right shoulder, which indicates forgiveness. She is also standing on a globe, with her feet on top of Oxfordshire, where this courtier lived. The portrait at the bottom right depicts England's victory over the Spanish Armada. You can look out the 2 windows behind Elizabeth's shoulders and see the peaceful sea with a number of ships on her over her right shoulder, and then the stormy sea battle over her left shoulder. Each portrait of Queen Elizabeth has this kind of allegorical layer to it, functioning with private and public propaganda messages. Why did Queen Elizabeth feel the need to use this kind of propaganda in artwork? Consider the difficulty for Queen Elizabeth. She's a female monarch in a man's world. England has had an unstable series of rulers in the reigns of her 2 siblings, going back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism. Some considered her mother, Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII to have been illegitimate, thereby making Elizabeth a bastard. So her legitimacy is under question. The Pope has issued a papal bull excommunicating Elizabeth and announcing that assassinating her would not be a mortal sin. So she's worried about people coming after her. She's worried about being poisoned or shot with an arrow when she goes out and makes public appearances. Add to the mix her status as a single woman. If she marries, will she still rule, or will her husband be the king? And whom should she marry? A foreign prince of some kind? What if he's Catholic? Would England be ruled by a Frenchman or a Spaniard? And then there's that troublesome Mary Queen of Scots, announcing to everyone that she's the rightful heir of both England and Scotland, as Henry VII is also her ancestor, and there are no questions as to the legitimacy of her parents' marriage. You can see why Elizabeth and her advisors felt the need to use propaganda to consolidate her image and her power in the minds of her people. What else does a clever Gloriana do? Well, she encourages her courtiers to woo and flatter her, instigating a court based on the ideals of courtly love, the people's for their unattainable queen. Courtiers, in effect, become suitors. Certainly some of her most loyal courtiers, like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and later his stepson, the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux. Elizabeth was even able to engage in diplomacy by hinting that she was willing to make a marriage alliance with certain foreign princes and then dithering about stringing these other countries along for as long as she could. If you're interested in Elizabeth in this role as a feudal lady and the object of courtly desire, I encourage you to read her exchange of letters with Sir Walter Raleigh and to dive into a bit of Spenser's Faerie Queene. To think about as you read. Consider the range of poems you'll see as you read: sonnets, pastoral poems, longer poems, and the different types of the poems poets represented. Are they coterie poets? Are they poets who need to survive on patronage? For these poems, formal elements like rhyme scheme and meter are important considerations. For instance, by knowing the type of sonnet, you can determine where the volta is and thus get greater insight into the poem's meaning. You can also look at how the sonnets are working with the Petrarchan ideals that they are inheriting. Do they confirm Petrarchan ideals, or do they subvert them in some ways? Think about the background of the poet's life and his or her historical context. How does this help you understand the poem? What is the poet's love life? In some cases, like Philip Sidney and Thomas Wyatt, this is important. In other times, it's not really, as in Shakespeare's sonnets. I hope you enjoyed this brief look at early modern poetry. This was an amazingly rich time of poetry, with poets using poetry as play, with so many forms being developed and perfected. I look forward to reading your discussion posts on this unit. Thank you and goodbye.